How about you, Michael and Devera?
We're ready.
We're ready. All right. Let's start. First of all, it's an honor to be interviewing you both for this continuation of a series of interviews with congregants. I actually see this interview as a continuation of the really lovely words that Isabel had for you at the Volunteer Appreciation Shabbat, Michael. Only this time, including both of you, Michael and Devera. Isabel, I want to just quote you, if I may. I wrote down a very memorable thing you said to Michael, that he had done so much on so many fronts for so long. And when I heard the cadences of that lovely phrase, I couldn't but think of Winston Churchill, who praised the RAF during World War II because they had done so much on so many, because because never was so much owed to so many, by so many to so few. I don't know if you had Churchill in mind, Isabel, but I thought it was a very apt association. TCC owes Michael and Devera a great deal on many fronts. So the way I thought we would proceed is with some questions. I have 9 questions, and the format I thought is that I would direct the first 3 to you, Michael, and ask Devera to add anything you'd like to add to what Michael says, and the next 3 to you, Devera, and to ask Michael to add anything to that he would like to add. And then I'll divide up the last 3 between you, but asking for both of your input on both. Now, the thing about these questions, they really are not about TCC, because these questions are intended to give us all a richer sense of your larger lives beyond TCC before you came here and the life you continue to have more broadly. However, there is one TCC related question I'd like to begin with to put us all on the same page, and that has to do with the Talmud class you both brought to TCC. I think for many humanistic Jews, the idea of a Talmud class is counterintuitive because many humanistic Jews regard both the Bible and the Talmud with heavy skepticism. Nonetheless, you have started this class, which has been quite successful. So my first question to you, and I'll start with you, Michael, and Devera, add anything that you might want to add. First of all, what is the Talmud, for those of us who may not know, and why was it important to you to bring a Talmud class to TCC?
Thank you, Ernie, for that question. And before we start there, I just want to thank you for taking the time to prep us and go through these questions and get to know us better. We appreciate that, so thank you. The Talmud, the Talmud, it was a long journey for me to the Talmud. Starting in my mid-30s and early 40s, I started wondering about my family history, but I was working 24/7 and didn't really have time to do anything about it. But when we retired in our early 50s, we both started doing genealogy, and we were able to get back maybe 100 years or so. But after 100 years and working on this for a year, I realized that there was no way that I could really understand my relatives, anything about them, without understanding the history. So I went back to school and took a couple of history courses and learned a little bit about that, got some more into my family. But then, fortunately, I ran into a Talmud class. We ran into a Talmud class in San Francisco, and that sort of filled in the years between 1800 and 2000 and 3,000, 4,000 years ago. Because in the Talmud, you're getting into a very intimate situation with our forefathers, really, and I love that aspect of it. So that was my journey to the Talmud, and I love the idea of learning about these this agricultural society, and the different ways people thought of things, the way interpersonal disputes were thought of and adjudicated. It's just a fascinating activity to be engaged in. And one more thing, and it links me totally to my ancestors. I feel part of them.
So I just wanted to add, one of the reasons that I really enjoyed the Talmud, but also why I was interested in even studying the Talmud, was that I was for a long time a legal secretary. And before I was a nurse, I was many things in my life. But when I was legal secretary, all the Jewish lawyers that I knew had studied the Talmud, and because Talmud is just filled with law and with the reasons for just this minutia of every single word, studying every single word. And I feel very strongly that it's helped keep my brain going, to be able to look at problems and situations from many different angles.
Those are very interesting answers from both of you. Let me just ask if there are other members of the congregation who would like to join your class. What should they do, Michael?
Just email me. There's my contact information is on the website on the Talmud page.
That sounds very good.
It's a very, let me just say that it's a very small class. There's usually only 6 to 8 of us at the most. And it gives everybody an opportunity to ask questions and dig in. And people, we've been doing this for about 6 years now. People come and people go. Some come for a couple of months and leave. Some come once and don't find they like it. And some people sort of graduate out of it. A couple of long-term or long-time attendees just sort of said, well, that's, I've had a couple of years, or I've had a year, and I learned a lot, and it's time to move on. And so we had a lot of people cycling through the Talmud class.
Well, that sounds great, with you two as the mainstays. Well, let me move on to something much more personal now. As Carol read in the section in the liturgy book on families, there are all kinds of families that connect with humanistic Judaism and also with TCC in particular. We have single people, we have couples, we have same-sex and opposite-sex couples, we have parents with children in different configurations. But you strike me, the two of you, as one of the sterling examples of a couple who relate to the congregation as a couple, where you have your individual contributions. We often see you together. So if it's not prying too much, I'd like to ask first how you met and what is the secret of the chemistry between you? Michael, that's to start with you.
Oh, to start with me. Well, I think that football has a lot to do with it. Professional football. When we first met, that was one of the things that we had in common. We had a strong sexual chemistry. We had the football as something that we could enjoy together. Tennis, we played tennis. And our interest in Judaism, we were both interested in Judaism. We didn't really know how to do it, but we struggled for a lot of years with how to be Jewish together, and eventually landing on the city congregation, which gave us the platform that where we could expand our Judaism. So I think that, what would you like to add to that, darling?
Well, we have very similar backgrounds in terms of family. We're both Litvaks, Lithuanian Jews, who are known to be argumentative, competitive, and we don't argue that much, but we are very competitive with each other. I don't know, did you ask how we met?
I'd like to know. Okay,
so we met in 1982, right? We both belonged or were members of this dating service called Jeff's Jewish Dating Service in Northern California. And it was not like, Tinder or any Jewish dating service that's today. It was certainly not digital. It was very analog. And we got these little pieces of paper for each other that had our name, our telephone number, our jobs, our interests, and our ages, and whether we were a smoker or non-smoker. And I got like about 8 or 9 of them a month, these little pieces of paper. And Michael called me, and we went out, and it was pretty instant that we started dating right away.
And the rest is history.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think another thing that we had in common was food and cooking.
Oh, yeah.
We like to cook. I mean, a lot of people when they date, they like go out and go to restaurants and stuff, but like our first dates were cooking for each other and talking about food and making bread and just doing those kinds of things, which we're still doing 40 years later.
Well, to pick up on this idea of things you do well together, not all couples are able to do that. One of the things you did together was you ran a business. And I'd like to ask you, and again, I'll start with you, Michael, ask you about the business you ran, because I think that's unusual among us, for us to have entrepreneurs who run a business. And I'd like to ask you to talk a little bit about that business, Michael, and also how you worked so well together in that business. I think that's an achievement for a couple to be able to do that.
Thank you. How did we do it? Well, I think the best part of it was that we each got to do what we liked best and what we were comfortable with. Devera liked the nuts and bolts of how the business was run, and I sort of liked the overall, like schmoozing with customers and designers and salespeople. And Devera came to love that part herself also. But we both enjoyed what we were doing, and we kept very busy. Why don't you add something to that?
Yeah, so I do want to tell you about Michael, the salesperson, because we have this business selling.
What was the business, Devera?
Okay, so we manufactured. We were in the glass business, and we had independent designers who designed tables, cocktail tables, dining tables, etagères, all kinds of desks made of glass. And some of it we had bent in an oven. We had a bunch of ovens. We had a big factory, with employees. And one of the things that I loved, we used to have these furniture markets that we would have to go to about 4 times a year and bring our new product to market. But one of the things I just loved about Michael was he was the most low-key salesperson I have ever seen in my life. We would go into somebody's office and we would sit there and he would just schmooze with the customer. And it was only in the last few minutes of maybe an hour conversation about the guys or the other couple or a guy's family in their lives. And then he would ask for an order, and almost always he got the order. So it was pretty incredible. And people recognized that he was not a hard sell kind of a guy. And I think that's why one of the reasons we were really successful in our business.
That is a gift, Michael, and you've described it beautifully, Devera. It could come in handy in a congregation in terms of winning new people into it. So I think we'll remember that about you, Michael.
Also, I want to say that one of the reasons for our success, Ernie, was it was being in the right place at the right time.
Yeah.
We were in a boom economy in California for many, many years. I mean, there were, of course, dips and that, but it was really a lot of luck plus hard work.
Well, I want to come back to California in a few minutes, but I want to go back in time for a little bit and go back to your childhoods and your upbringings. You mentioned, Michael, that one of the things that drew you together was that your family backgrounds were similar. Or I think you mentioned, Devera, through the Litzbach connection. But for the promotion for this event, Devera, you described yourself as a secular Jewish Southerner. And in our preparation for this event, Michael, you characterized yourself as the black sheep of your family. So what I'd like to do, beginning with you, Devera, if you could tell us a little bit about your upbringing and any features of it that strike you as especially Jewish or humanistic.
Well, one thing that people say have a hard time understanding about me is that my father was in the military. He was in the Air Force, and he was in the Air Force for over 30 years and was at one time the highest ranking Jewish officer in the Air Force. And there weren't, like 80 million Jews in the Air Force or in the military. And so it was, I can't say that I grew up with we went to the base chapel always had a rabbi because there were, airmen who were Jewish, and there were always enough, at least 100 on a base of maybe 20,000 soldiers. There was always enough to have high holiday services and Shabbat services. And we didn't go to Shabbats, but we did go to the high holidays. But my family, my mother and my father, both were the youngest of many children and the only ones who even graduated from high school. And their parents, both of their parents were immigrants, and all of their siblings were Orthodox. My parents were the only ones who initially left Orthodoxy because it was not really reasonable to be Orthodox, and my parents weren't interested anyhow. They were very secular, and most of their friends were not Jewish. And that was the life that I was brought up in. I mean, I had a Jewish education in that I went to Sunday school. We did have a Sunday school on the base. But I had no interest in they didn't have bat mitzvahs back then. And I wasn't interested in that. So that's my background.
Devera, you mentioned your dad, that he had a very high rank in the Air Force, and as a Jew, it was a little unusual. But I think you mentioned in our prep that he did something else very distinctive in terms of integrating the base. Could you talk a little about that?
Yeah, when President Truman signed an executive order after the end of the Second World War to integrate the military, which was not integrated. My father, who was not that high ranking at the time, but he was just an officer in the...
This would be like 50, right?
Yeah, 1949 or 50. He was given the job of integrating the base where we were, which was in Biloxi, Mississippi. And he did that very successfully. The only rule that was made was that there were to be no there were to be the base was to be fully integrated, including housing, barracks, everything. And the only restriction was that if someone got into any kind of trouble off the base, the military would not take responsibility for any issues that happened off the base. It was Biloxi, Mississippi, which.
Say no more.
Yeah.
That's a distinction to have in your past, Devera. Michael, what would you like to add about your background?
I want to say that I'm a product of a mixed marriage. My mother's family were atheists. I mean, they identified as Jewish, but they were basically atheists, and they prided themselves on going to the races on Yom Kippur. That was their idea of like putting a thumb in the eye of the rabbis that had controlled them when they were children. They didn't like it. So they were totally atheist. Although my mother's father was not religious, but he was more into supporting the Reform congregation in San Jose, California. So there was about 300 Jewish families there in the 50s. So my mother and father met at University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana. My father had grown up in Joliet in an Orthodox family, grew up in a Yiddish-speaking Jewish Orthodox family. But after they got married and moved away from his family, from Joliet, Illinois to the West Coast, he had been in the service and was familiar with the West Coast from the service and felt there was a lot of opportunity. So he moved, and so they got away from the Orthodoxy and sort of found their place in Reform. That's the way. So I was raised Reform. We were high holiday Jews, but I did go to Sunday school. My mother taught in Sunday school, so I was exposed to Judaism at an early age. But I didn't like the bar mitzvah, the memorization, and actually, the rabbi wrote my Devar Torah for the bar mitzvah, which I just thought was the worst thing. I was not capable of writing it myself. I was so disinterested in my Torah portion. But after that, they said, well, just do it. And like once you do it, you do whatever you want. And so I turned my back on Judaism for until around the time when I met Devera. I had a marriage to a Catholic woman that didn't work out, and realized that I really need to hook up with a Jewish woman. And we were both looking for a mate at the same time.
Well, it's a wonderful success story in terms of marrying Judaism and each other when you could well have left it. Let me move a little bit further up in time. One of the great things about being over 60 years old, for those of us here who are that, is that we can remember the 1960s, which in the history books is a memorable decade. And you were young adults, both of you, during that time. So I'd like to linger with that decade for a minute. And I'm going to start with you, Devera, again. In 1968, you were working for the Justice Department in Washington, D.C., and you shared with me during our prep time that working for the government turned you into a radical, and that after working there, you moved to California and joined the various protest movements out there in the late 60s and early 70s. And as we're in the thick of protest movements now, could you talk a little bit about what it was like back then to be involved in protest?
Well, I mean, it was Vietnam. It was Vietnam. I think I think that one of the things that was so great about the protest movements back then, in the late 60s, early 70s, were I was working at Stanford University in the law school, and there were, and I was the same age as most of the law students, And I think, and so they were my friends, but I think one of the great things was the teach-ins. And the teach-ins were very eye-opening to me. I mean, I had worked in the Justice Department before that, and I was working in the Justice Department for the Deputy Attorney General at the time. And it was during the time of the Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy assassinations. And I did see the federal government actually controlled the responses of all of the cities where rioting was happening. And I thought the response from the federal government was not understanding what was really happening, and why people would be upset. And, you know, they were sending out troops, and it was, you know, I mean, I understand cities were burning, but on the other hand, there was no understanding or movement in the government to do anything about what was the root cause of what was happening. And then,
which was the war, right?
Which was, it wasn't the war. It was, you know, it was the whole Black situation relating to now. But in terms of the war, there were teach-ins that were at Stanford and in all universities. I'm sure they had them at Columbia also. I know they did. That were talking about the corporate structure of this country and how people were sitting on the boards of directors of all of these companies, defense companies, Department of Defense, State Department, all of these big auto companies and oil companies all had all of the boards of directors were all the same people running the country. And I was, that was a big motivation for me to be radicalized.
Which you've remained, have you?
Pardon?
Have you remained radical, would you say?
Yeah, I mean, I think politically I'm pretty far on the left. I'm not running around now because there's a little COVID going on.
Yeah.
And I have not participated, and it's painful to not be able to do that. Only thing I can do is stand on our balcony and look down at Grand Army Plaza and see what's going on, but which is nothing much right now.
But Devera, it can also be painful to participate in them. And what I'd like to do is to ask if you'd share with the group an encounter you had with the police back then.
Yeah, so I was in a sit-in at Stanford, and I was, the police, the Palo Alto police, broke through the door, one of the doors. We were locked in a room, in a space. There were probably about 100 of us
At Stanford University.
At Stanford, and the police broke through one end with a battering ram. And I was probably about 40 pounds less than I am now. And the next thing I knew, I'm not a fast runner. The next thing I knew, I was flying through the air, and I woke up in a pool of blood on the floor. And it turned out that I had been hit in the back of the head with the billy club hard enough to knock me flying through the air. So I had a very bad concussion, which I still suffer some memory issues. And that was That was in like 1971. So it's a long time.
That's a painful memory, but it's very relevant, I think, to some of the discussions we're having now about police activity. Michael, did you want to add anything about the 60s, or do you think they're well forgotten?
No, I don't really have anything to add to the 60s, but I do want to say that that was one of the things that attracted me to Devera, because she did the things that I didn't do, and I felt like, here I'm with somebody that's are doing the things that should be done, and so it made it pretty easy for me. But during that time, I'd gotten married early and had a child already by the time Devera was going through this and trying to find my place in the world.
I think one nice thing you both brought out is that part of the secret of a good couple relationship is not just similarities, but complementarities, and that each of you can supply for the other something they might lack in themselves. And that's a very nice feature. Well, we've done some chronology. I want to move in and do a little geography. You've mentioned California a couple of times. You both lived in San Francisco, I think, for about 10 years. I have in my notes, I think it was from 1991 to 2001. San Francisco, for any LGBT person such as myself, is like a mecca. And on the few times when I have visited there, I've been very moved by the city itself, just to be in the space of it, just to be walking in the streets of it. And even the name itself, when I hear it, San Francisco, it kind of tugs at my heart, as the old song says, about leaving our heart there. I never lived there long enough to leave my heart there, but you may have. And so what I'd like to do now is just ask you for some of your memories of San Francisco. I know that you lived in a very beautiful neighborhood with a great view. Sticking with you, Devera, again, to start us off, can you tell us a little about the neighborhood you lived in, and maybe just a couple of good memories of the city?
So we lived in a neighborhood called Potrero Hill, and we lived at the top of the hill, and we had a view of all of downtown San Francisco, and of the bay, the San Francisco Bay, and it was beautiful. And I think the thing that I loved about San Francisco was, and I still love, is it's a very free place. And the fact that because we were,
it was free.
It was free at that time. The fact that there was, I think, a really enormous, it was just a comme il faut that straight people and gay people intermingled, and there was really no discrimination that there was in other cities. And I particularly remember with glee, we were having dinner with friends who lived like a block from Castro Street, actually. They lived in the Castro, but a block from the street. And it was a gay day parade. And I just remember seeing this totally naked person climb up on a light pole. And it was just, everybody was cheering, and it was just such fun. And people were just very accepting and open. And I love that. I love that feeling of people being able to be who they are. It was a wonderful place to be.
Michael, what would you add, if anything?
So this place that we lived in was an 8-unit condo, and it was brand new, and we were running the business out of our apartment. Our partners were 50 miles east in the industrial suburbs running the factory. And so we were working out, and we needed space really bad. We were living in Pacific Heights, which was, it was a nice apartment, but it was getting small in there. We had one full-time employee in the office in a 2-bedroom apartment. And we saw this place, and we bought it without seeing it. We couldn't go in to see it, but the price was right. And we could only look in the door, and the minute I saw the view, I knew it didn't really make any difference. And so we bought it without actually walking through, which turned out to work out okay. But the way it turned out is that it was 8 units, and everybody socialized with each other. It was a very tight community. And so we developed a couple of lifelong friendships there, and did childcare for some of our neighbors, and had dinners and little parties and that. So it was just a great experience. And I also liked the feeling of the openness of San Francisco and the freedom and being around all these people who had been run out. I mean, the LGBT community had been run out of wherever they were in because
Right.
It was uncomfortable, and here they could do and be whoever they were and not have to worry about. And I thought that was a wonderful thing. Also, during the years we were there was the digital gold rush. We were there for the beginning of Google, and just the whole idea of the internet and online commerce. And it was a feeling of gold rush, very excitement. Coders were coming in from all over the world to code in San Francisco and then down the peninsula. So it was a great place to be between like 92 and between 91 and 2001. Those are the years we lived there.
Well, I get the feeling you have left some of your heart there, but then you moved to New York City, and for many people that would be a culture shock. Sometimes when people compare California in general to New York, they say these are two completely different worlds. And yet, you made up your minds after you had retired from the business that you were going to move, and you chose a city that many people choose to move away from when they retire, and you chose to move here. So tell us about New York. What was it like to move here from California? What do you like about the city?
We moved here for several reasons. First of all, we really wanted to move. I wanted to move to Rome.
Oh.
Italy. Did you want to move there?
Rome or Paris.
Rome or Paris. But
set your sights high.
But my mama, who Michael called Mama when he first met her long before we were married, Mama lived in Virginia, and she was in her early 90s. And we realized we really could not move out of the country with my mother. And she was mentally fine, but getting very physically frail. So we decided that we had been getting the New York Times for about 10 years just to see what was exciting going on in the world, in our biggest city. And Michael and I both love drama, plays. And we kept reading the Times every day and seeing all these things, all these plays and speakers and all this stuff to do. And we had one theater that we went to in San Francisco, that had one play every 3 months or something. So we decided that we would move to New York and move Mama up with us, which is what we did. Plus, we just could not take driving the car anymore. The traffic we couldn't go out. On the weekends, the traffic was intolerable.
We looked forward to the subway.
Yeah, so we thought we would come here. We thought this would be a perfect place for us.
And it was easy. It was easy landing for us because we had kept connections with a couple who sold furniture for us in New York City. They were our sales reps, the Edelsteins. And we had been in touch with them, and they'd come like to visit us in California. And we'd stayed with them when we came on sales trips. They'd take us around to the customers here. We only had a few, but anyway, so they showed us around, and they just helped us get oriented. They lived on the Upper East Side, and so we moved to the Upper East Side. And it was just an easy way. I mean, they were handy. They gave us advice. They sort of looked after us. They were older. So it was an easy, smooth move. And Mama died a couple of years later, but in the meantime, while we were here, we fell in love with New York, and we could never live anywhere else. Sometimes I think of running to safety like all the other people that can afford it, leaving the city and getting out. But I want to be here with all of you who are staying around, and if we go down, we'll all go down together. That's
one of the pleasures of working on the liturgy committee with you, Devera. Devera and I were both on the liturgy committee, which Carol Melman chaired. One of the pleasures was meeting in your apartment. It's a very beautiful space, which I wouldn't want to leave either if I lived there. My partner is an architectural historian. And when I told him that you were living in a building designed by Richard Meyer, he was very impressed. So can you just say a little bit about your apartment, how you found it, and maybe describe it a little bit?
I think that we had a loft in NoHo that we'd lived in for 6 years, and it got somebody bought in. We were on the board of the building. It was just a 7-unit building, but we got into a political situation where we were forced out, and we had to find another place to live. And Devera found this, like looking on the internet, and we thought, well, could we actually live in a fancy building like that? And the mortgage rates were real low, and we just like scraped up everything, put down a payment, and here we are.
Well, you're very please.
We have glass everywhere. We have hardly any space for pictures. We're surrounded by glass.
Well, and you're also very generous with sharing your space. I think any of us who have been to your apartment for various TCC events know that. Because of time, I want to finish up with just one more question, which to me is the most maybe important question. This is a question about your philosophy of life. And I'd like to introduce this question by remembering back on the liturgy committee that we worked on together, Devera, when we were putting together the High Holiday book, which we used for the first time last High Holidays. Devera, you were a great advocate for including a song by Leonard Cohen, Who by Fire, to be part of the Yom Kippur liturgy. And some of us were surprised by your advocacy for that song, but we came to see what a brilliant suggestion it was. And it made me wonder what Leonard Cohen means to you, and if there's some way that very philosophical poet and singer expresses your philosophy of life. So I'm asking that to you, Devera, but also to you, Michael.
Leonard Cohen was, I love Michael, but if I had met Leonard Cohen before and he fell in love with me, I would have plotzed. I always was in love with him from the first time I ever saw him. And for some reason, his poetry, and that's what his songs are all their poetry. He was a poet, and the words, his words, his lyrics have had meaning for me all throughout my adult life. I've listened to his music since I was in my 20s, and whether it was about depression or happiness or couples or breakups or the world. It always had great meaning to, he always had great meaning to me. And as I've gotten older, and particularly in the last few years, his latest, the last few albums that he did were about his impending death. And I relate to that. I mean, I
Being in
know
our late 70s.
being in our late
We're getting there.
70s, we're getting there. But, you know, and hopefully we'll last a little while longer in good health. But I know that I have the same feeling about life and death that he did. Even though some of his stuff was a little religious, but his Who by Fire, I thought was just the words, and Sema would probably, or Ray would probably know how to pronounce this word, the Unatana
Unatana
Tokef. That the words that were in English for the religious version of that, where it talks about only repentance and you know, prayerfulness and all that can help us avert these decrees, just so turned me off of religious Judaism. And so the Who by Fire, which doesn't talk about that, and makes it a little ambiguous about who shall I say is calling, was very meaningful to me.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad we have it in the liturgy book, Devera. Thanks to you. Michael, anything to add?
Well, I want to say that about Leonard Cohen is that he was a poet and a writer, and realized that he'd never be able to make a living writing poetry, and that's how we got into the song business. As far as my feelings about him and explaining what I appreciate about his work, I just want to read just a few of his lines to explain who he is. I was selling holy trinkets. I was dressing kind of sharp. I had a kitty in the kitchen and a panther in the yard. In the prison of the gifted, I was friendly with the guards, so I never had to witness what happened to the heart.
Well, that actually makes a very nice closure for us, Michael and Devera. I want to thank you for sharing a bit of your life with us. I think so often in congregations, we become identified with the work we do for the congregation, and the rest of us kind of vanishes from view. So this interview gives us all a chance to have a better sense of you both